Imagine for a second breathing in this deadly gas that has no smell,
Right.
no color, and it doesn't even make you cough.
It just kind of makes you feel pleasantly sleepy, right?
Yeah, spot on. You do not even realize you are suffocating until it is, well, far too late to step outside for fresh air.
Which is terrifying to think about.
It really is. And in 1878, a bishop named J.C. Ryle looked at the church of his day and concluded that millions of people were quietly suffocating from this kind of invisible atmosphere.
And they were just completely oblivious to the danger.
Totally oblivious. Welcome to Reform Thinking. I am your host, and our mission for this deep dive is to step back from the constant noise of the society we live in.
And I am so ready to jump into this with you. We are taking a magnifying glass to a highly practical essay from J.C. Ryle's classic work, Practical Religion.
Yeah, specifically, we are looking at his chapter on the world.
Which is such a heavy topic.
It is. We really want to figure out what the biblical command from 2 Corinthians, the one to come out and be separate, actually looks like in your daily life on, like, a random Tuesday.
Because it is so easy to agree with a verse like that in theory.
Oh, absolutely. But applying it,
Yeah.
that is where things get really messy.
Yeah. I mean, does it mean you delete all your social media apps?
Right. Or does it mean you stop talking to your secular neighbors over the fence?
Do you only listen to a specific genre of music?
These are the real questions.
Yeah.
And Ryle tackles this head-on with a pastoral sharpness that just cuts right through our modern excuses.
He really forces us to confront the reality that there is a massive, unbridgeable difference between just calling yourself a Christian and, well, actually living as a new creature in Christ.
So we're going to look at the invisible threats around us, dismantle the false ideas of separation that well-meaning people fall for, and uncover the true battlegrounds where this spiritual conflict takes place.
Setting the theological framework for this discussion is absolutely crucial because Ryle establishes a boundary on his very first page.
And it's a boundary that really challenges our modern sensibilities right out of the gate.
Right. Before he even attempts to define what this invisible threat is, he clarifies that his entire argument assumes two very distinct categories of people.
Converted and unconverted.
Yeah, exactly. Well, precisely that. In our current cultural moment, we do not like categories.
No, we prefer shades of gray.
We like to think of spirituality as a broad spectrum, where everyone is just at a different stage of enlightenment.
Like we are all basically heading up the same mountain.
Yes, but Ryle operates from a thoroughly biblical, historic Protestant perspective. He asserts that true Christians are meant to be a peculiar people.
There has to be a visible, categorical difference between believers and unbelievers.
He makes it clear that if you assume everyone who occasionally attends a worship service or, just tries to be a decent person is automatically a Christian,
then you will care very little about this topic.
right? The command to separate will seem baffling, maybe even offensive to you.
But if you are in earnest about your soul, this binary view clarifies everything.
It raises the stakes for you, the listener. It forces you to evaluate which category you belong to before you can even begin to apply the practical instructions about separation.
I think we need to unpack this concept of the world right away.
Yeah, because the phrasing alone causes so much confusion.
It really does. When we hear that the world is an enemy, it is incredibly easy to misunderstand what the threat actually is.
And Ryle makes a critical distinction here.
He does. When he warns about the world, he is not talking about the physical matter of the earth.
No, he points right back to the book of Genesis. He notes that the mountains, the oceans, the stars, the animals.
All of this material creation is very good.
Right. He actually calls the idea that physical matter is inherently sinful a foolish heresy.
It is a very old error, actually, this idea that the spirit is good and physical stuff is evil.
You can look at a sunset or a mountain range and see undeniable lessons of God's wisdom and majesty.
The physical creation is not the enemy. The true enemy, as Ryle defines it, is a system of human thought.
What's fascinating here is how he describes that collective mindset. It is the mindset of people who prioritize the earth over heaven,
Time over eternity.
the body over the soul, and pleasing men over pleasing God.
It is that invisible atmosphere I mentioned earlier.
The world isn't some obvious monster with fangs waiting to attack you in an alley.
No, it is more like that carbon monoxide. It is an odorless atmospheric pressure that quietly puts your soul to sleep.
You do not even realize you are breathing it in until you're completely numb to spiritual realities.
So how exactly does a person detect this slow fade in their own life when the threat is so subtle and, well, pervasive?
Detecting that slow fade requires a constant, rigorous comparison of your own mind against the testimony of Scripture.
Which is why Ryle brings in an overwhelming amount of biblical evidence to prove his point.
He really wants to show that this specific mindset, this prioritizing of the temporal over the eternal, is a lethal danger to the soul.
He references the historic church catechism, right?
Yeah, which is a traditional question and answer format used for centuries to instruct believers in basic doctrines.
And that catechism identifies the flesh, the devil, and the world as the three terrible foes a baptized Christian must fight.
But he goes straight to the text of the Bible to unleash just a barrage of warnings.
From the Apostle Paul, we hear direct commands not to be conformed to this world.
Paul also gives us the tragic example of Demas.
Oh, Demas. That one is rough.
It is. Demas was a companion of Paul, a man who saw miracles and heard the greatest preacher of the early church.
Yet Paul writes that Demas forsook him because he loved this present world.
And from James, the brother of Jesus, we hear the blunt reality that friendship with the world is absolute enmity with God.
John tells us that all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is passing away.
And Jesus himself, in the parable of the sower, warns that the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word.
They make it completely unfruitful.
Ryle provides over 20 distinct texts that all point to the same staggering conclusion.
That the world is a mortal enemy to the Christian soul.
The reason open rebellion isn't the primary cause of people losing their faith is precisely because of the subtle nature of this enemy.
Right. People do not usually wake up one morning, shake their fist at the sky, and decide to loudly rebel against God.
Instead, they try to hold on to both. They want to get to heaven eventually, but they also want the approval, the wealth, and the comfort of the present age right now.
That desire to hold on to both is what causes the slow drift.
Yeah.
And it brings up a really tragic image that Ryle uses to illustrate this point.
He talks about people who start out so well in their faith.
He compares them to figures like Abraham and Moses in their youth. These people bid fair for heaven.
They leave the harbor of their childhood home with bright prospects, perhaps carrying a father's blessing and mother's sincere prayers.
They are launched out onto the ocean of adult life, and looking at them, you think they are absolutely going to make it.
They have all the right answers.
But they do not shipwreck on some massive, obvious rock of blatant atheism or violent crime.
No, they end their voyage in shallows and misery purely because of the seductions of the world.
They slowly drift off course, one tiny compromise at a time.
They end up like Lot's wife. She was physically rescued from Sodom, but looked back because her heart was still tied to the comfort of the city.
Or they end up like Demas, who just loved the present world too much to stay the course with Paul in a cold prison cell.
The tragedy is the utter quietness of the ruin. No alarms go off.
So, if we understand that the physical creation isn't the problem, but this invisible system of worldly thinking is so toxic.
What happens when sincere believers realize this danger, panic, and mistakenly try to run away from physical society to stay pure?
It seems like the natural human instinct is to flee. If the world is a toxic gas, the instinct is to hold your breath and lock yourself in a hermetically sealed room.
How does Ryle address this instinct to just hide from everyone?
Well, the instinct to isolate is incredibly strong, especially for a new believer who suddenly realizes the danger.
But Ryle dismantles this monastic urge methodically.
He lists 6 specific points about what separation is not, establishing that running away is a false solution.
His first point addresses our daily occupations.
He argues that the command to come out and be separate does not mean Christians should abandon lawful callings, trades, professions, or businesses.
There is absolutely no biblical warrant for a believer to refuse to be a soldier, a sailor, a lawyer, a doctor, a merchant, or a tradesman.
He provides clear New Testament examples to prove this too.
Cornelius was a Roman centurion, Luke was a physician, and Zenos was a lawyer.
In fact, Ryle argues that idleness itself is a sin.
Right, he quotes the Apostle Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, which states that if a man will not work, neither shall he eat.
Work was instituted by God in the Garden of Eden before sin ever entered the picture. It is a good thing.
A lawful calling actually acts as a remedy against temptation because it keeps the mind occupied and useful.
Giving up a regular business and leaving the marketplace entirely to the wicked under the pretense that the business environment might harm your religion.
Ryle describes that as lazy and cowardly conduct.
The true calling is to bring your religion into your business,
To work with absolute integrity and honesty in the secular sphere.
rather than using your faith as an excuse to retreat from the heavy responsibilities of adult life.
I know that keeping your job makes sense, but I want to push back on how far this integration goes.
Okay, let's hear it.
Ryle's second and third points say we shouldn't decline all interaction with unconverted people or refuse to go into their society.
He points out that Jesus and his disciples went to marriage feasts and sat at the tables of Pharisees.
Paul gave instructions on how to behave if an unbeliever invites you to a feast, which implies you are fully allowed to accept the invitation.
But wait, if I'm supposed to avoid the worldly mindset, why am I going to a secular dinner party?
Doesn't that expose me to the exact carbon monoxide we were talking about?
The balance here seems incredibly precarious.
If you cut yourself off from everyone who doesn't believe what you believe, you lose every single opportunity to do good.
You lose the chance to bring the light of the gospel into dark places.
But even beyond dinner parties, Ryle talks about not ignoring politics, art, science, and literature.
There is a real tendency among some very sincere believers to think that if they read a newspaper, care about government legislation, or study biology, they are being worldly.
But Paul knew the value of good government. He urged prayers for leaders so that Christians could live quiet and peaceable lives.
Paul even quoted heathen writers and secular poets in his own speeches.
Ignorance of secular realities actually breeds contempt for the faith.
Ryle tells this brilliant story of a blacksmith who absolutely refused to listen to a local clergyman preach the gospel.
Oh, I love this story. The blacksmith wanted nothing to do with him, assuming the minister was just a guy with his head in the clouds.
But then the blacksmith found out that the clergyman actually understood the physical properties of iron.
Once the blacksmith realized the minister understood the real, tangible world, he finally agreed to listen to the spiritual message.
That story alone shows how foolish it is to pride yourself on your ignorance of secular things.
It perfectly illustrates why artificial boundaries fail to accomplish true spiritual goals.
And why understanding the physical world actually builds a bridge for the gospel.
This brings us to Ryle's fourth and fifth points on false separation, which deal directly with the external display of holiness and the physical retreat from society.
Ryle warns heavily against being singular, eccentric, or peculiar in your dress, your manners, or your voice.
If you wear strange clothes or speak in an unnatural, whining, overly religious tone of voice just to draw attention to how separate you are making a massive error.
He meets that Jesus and the apostles dressed and behaved like normal people in their respective ranks of life.
They did not wear bizarre uniforms. It was the Pharisees who made their phylacteries broad.
For the listener, a phylactery was a small leather box containing scripture verses that a Jewish man would wear on his forehead or arm during prayer.
The Pharisees intentionally made these boxes huge, and they enlarged the borders of their garments purely to be seen by men and appear hyper-spiritual.
True sanctity and artificial sanctimoniousness are vastly different things.
Trying to look holy by wearing conspicuously ugly clothes or acting unnaturally grave only gives the enemies of the faith an easy target to mock.
Taking this a step further, Ryle attacks the hermit fallacy directly.
He states that separation does not mean retiring from mankind to shut yourself up in a monastery, a convent, or a cave.
This physically violates the explicit prayer of Christ in John chapter 17.
Where Jesus prayed for his disciples. I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil.
True believers are meant to mix in the world, stand their ground manfully, and show the grace of God in their daily positions.
Through patience, meekness, and purity.
You cannot keep the world and the devil out of your heart by hiding in holes and corners.
Because you carry your own sinful nature right into the cave with you.
That is a vital theological reality that so many people miss you. Bring your own corrupt nature with you wherever you run.
Your location changes, but your heart remains the same.
And that leads right into the final and perhaps most controversial point Ryle makes about what separation is not.
He says it does not mean withdrawing from every church assembly just because there are unconverted members present in the pews.
This is a trap so many zealous people fall into today.
They get a taste of true spiritual life. They look around their local congregation and they see people who are clearly just going through the motions.
They see hypocrites, so they leave.
They refuse to take communion if ungodly people are at the table.
Ryle calls this a grievous mistake and a pure invention of man.
He points out a staggering fact. Jesus deliberately allowed Judas Iscariot to be an apostle for 3 years.
Knowing exactly who he was and even gave him the Lord's Supper.
Jesus taught in the parable of the wheat and the tares that the converted and unconverted will grow together in the visible church until the final harvest.
And we cannot perfectly divide them now.
If you are waiting for a perfectly pure church, a flawless congregation where everyone is fully sanctified,
You will be waiting until the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven.
to separate yourself from Christian ordinances because others use them unworthily is an unscriptural position.
So, having dismantled all these false ideas, we cannot run away to a cave, we cannot dress weirdly to show off, we cannot abandon our jobs, and we cannot demand a flawless local church.
We have to pivot. We are out of the monastery and back in the messy battlefield of everyday life.
What does true separation actually look like in action when you are sitting in a cubicle or attending a neighborhood barbecue?
True separation, as Ryle articulates it, begins entirely in the mind, with a fundamental shift in the standard by which you judge reality.
His first defining marker of true separation is steadily and habitually refusing to be guided by the world's standard of right and wrong.
The consensus of the crowd, the idea that everybody does it or everybody thinks so or everybody will be there.
That means absolutely nothing to the true Christian.
The only valid standard is, what saith the Scripture?
This requires immense internal resolve because it means you cannot think lightly of sins just because society has completely normalized them.
If society says that swindling in business, breaking marriage vows, or gambling are just minor human flaws or normal behaviors,
The believer must reject that consensus completely if God calls it sin.
you must be willing to stand entirely alone in your town, your family, or your workplace rather than go against the Bible.
This intellectual and moral independence is the absolute bedrock of genuine separation.
Once that internal standard is in place, Ryle moves to the application of it in daily life, and he zeroes in on something surprisingly mundane.
But incredibly relevant, how you spend your leisure time.
He argues that honorable occupation and lawful business are actually massive safeguards for the soul.
The devil finds it very hard to get a hearing from a busy person whose hands and mind are fully occupied.
But we have to look closely at our daily rhythms to understand the danger zones.
Why does Ryle identify the evening hours when the day's labor ends as the absolute greatest point of vulnerability for a person's soul?
This raises an important question. I love that he focuses on the evenings because his psychological insight here is just spot on.
Think about how you feel when the day's work is finally over.
You naturally unbend, you relax, you take the armor off.
During the day, your mind is engaged in your tasks, meeting deadlines, keeping the machinery of your life running. You are alert.
But in the evening, you let your guard down, and that is exactly when temptation strikes.
Ryle talks about the 19th century equivalents of this: the poor man going to the public house for a pint, the tradesman sitting in the inn parlor for hours swapping stories.
The higher classes throwing late-night card parties.
But I know for me, and for almost everyone listening, the modern equivalents hit so close to home.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When 8 p.m. rolls around and my brain is completely fried from work, the instinct to just melt into the couch is overwhelmingly strong.
The evening is when we engage in late-night doom scrolling.
Mindlessly swiping through social media feeds or binge-watching hours of media.
Media that slowly saturates our minds with exactly the worldly standards we are supposed to be rejecting.
We feed ourselves the carbon monoxide on a glowing screen.
And it is so easy to justify this behavior. We say, I worked hard all day, I'm exhausted, my willpower is depleted, I just need to turn my brain off.
But Ryle asks if exhaustion is a valid excuse for dropping our guard.
He advises making a settled rule to never waste your evenings.
He says we must make time for calm thought, Bible reading, and prayer.
Even if people think you are unsocial or overly strict for turning down an invitation to a late-night event.
It's better to have a good conscience.
And he connects this directly to his next point. You have to prevent even lawful business from consuming your soul.
You cannot let your job eat up your Sundays or destroy your private communion with God.
You have to be able to say to your career, stand back, there is a limit.
The historical examples Ryle uses to support that point about holding the world at arm's length are quite striking.
He points to figures like Daniel from the Old Testament, who is essentially the prime minister of Babylon.
And General Havelock, a highly respected British military leader in the 19th century.
These were men who carried massive governmental and military burdens.
They were not monks living in silence. They were actively managing empires, logistics, and armies.
Yet they firmly prioritized their private prayers and scriptural study, no matter the cost to their schedule.
They chose to risk present loss, the mockery of their peers, or even career advancement, rather than let their souls wither under the crushing weight of secular responsibilities.
This requires a level of self-denial that goes far beyond merely avoiding bad things.
Right. It means placing strict limits on good things.
This principle applies directly to Ryle's teaching on innocent recreations.
He does not condemn exercise, sports, or games of skill like chess.
He acknowledges that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that the human body and mind require relaxation and diversion to function properly.
But the severe danger lies in excess.
The Christian must know how to say hold enough to lawful recreations before they morph into poisons.
If a harmless hobby starts secularizing your soul, pulling your thoughts constantly down to earth,
Draining your bank account or interfering with your private devotion,
it has crossed the line from recreation to idle.
you have to possess the firmness to stop, even if your friends ridicule you for not knowing how to just relax and enjoy yourself.
The idea of saying hold enough to something that isn't even a sin in itself is so countercultural.
We live in a society of gluttony, where more is always considered better.
It is one thing to manage your own schedule and your own hobbies with that kind of strictness.
You can control how much time you spend on the golf course or how many hours you spend watching sports.
You can set a timer on your phone.
But what happens when this standard clashes with your closest relationships?
That brings us to a massive, difficult area in Ryle's argument, the law of contagion.
We move from managing our time to managing our friendships, our marriages, and our public amusements.
Ryle strongly warns against cultivating intimate friendships with those who completely disregard God.
He is very careful to say we must treat everyone with courtesy and kindness.
We do business with them, we love our neighbors, we help them in a crisis.
But intimate friendship, the sharing of your deepest heart, is entirely different.
You cannot be closely tied to someone without their character affecting yours.
If you choose friends who do not care about the Bible or holiness, you will soon find their tastes, and your tastes are completely incompatible.
You will either have to give up the intimacy, or you will compromise your own faith just to keep the peace and avoid awkwardness.
And if that is true for casual friendships, it is infinitely more true for marriage.
Ryle, strictly, almost severely, commands unmarried Christians never to marry an unbeliever.
The theological reality behind Ryle's severe warning about marriage is staggering, and he explains it with a very simple medical axiom.
Health is not infectious, but disease is.
If you put a sick person in a room with a healthy person, the healthy person does not magically cure the sick one by proximity.
Rather, the healthy person catches the disease.
When you bind a praying, God-fearing Christian to someone who takes no interest in serious religion, the result is almost universally tragic.
Because of the natural human inclination towards sin, what Reformed theology understands as total depravity, gravity always pulls downward.
For the listener who hears total depravity and thinks it means everyone is a serial killer, let me clarify.
It does not mean humans are as evil as they could possibly be.
It means that sin has infected every faculty of our nature, our mind, our will, our emotions.
Because of this internal infection, it is always easier for us to sink than to rise.
The good person usually sinks to the level of the bad, or at least has their spiritual vitality severely stunted.
Rather than pulling the unconverted person up.
To hope that you will convert a spouse after marriage by compromising a clear biblical command beforehand is a massive delusion.
Ryle is so emphatic here that he says you had better die than marry an unbeliever.
If you depart from this resolution, you are essentially destroying your own peace and comfort for the rest of your life.
You are tying a heavy weight to yourself in the spiritual race.
This strict adherence to spiritual health over social or romantic convenience extends directly into his views on public amusements,
which he addresses in detail regarding theaters, horse races, and in his appendix, balls, cards, and field sports.
I really want to focus on that weight analogy because it is so vivid. Marrying an unbeliever is like tying a heavy millstone around your neck while trying to run a marathon.
You might finish the race, you might be saved in the end, but it will be so as by fire, and every single step of your life will be agonizing.
You will never be able to share your deepest joys or your deepest fears about eternity with the person sleeping next to you.
So what does this all mean for you if you are single and seeking a partner right now?
It means that physical attraction, financial stability, and shared secular interests, like hiking or movies, are absolutely secondary to the question of whether this person has a renewed heart.
It requires immense faith to trust God with your singleness rather than settle for an unequal yoke out of loneliness.
That same principle of assessing the hidden dangers applies to amusements.
In the appendix, Ryle looks at things like dancing, card playing, and field sports.
He is honest enough to admit that jumping around to music, the physical act of dancing, is not a sin.
A horse running fast on a track is not a sin.
A game of cards might even be a useful mental exercise to keep an elderly, lethargic person awake on a winter evening.
But Ryle evaluates these activities by their tendencies and accompaniments.
Modern ball-going in his day, and certainly clubbing or similar nightlife environments today, involve late hours, vanity, jealousy, extravagant dressing, and vain conversation.
Horse races in theaters are almost invariably tied to gambling, betting, and other vices.
You cannot just look at the core activity in a vacuum and ignore the atmosphere it brings with it.
If the activity acts as a gateway to sin, or places you in an environment where the world's standard is celebrated,
It is a severe hazard to your soul.
evaluating the tendencies and accompaniments is a highly mature way of viewing Christian liberty.
It moves the believer past the childish, legalistic question of, is there a specific Bible verse that explicitly says I cannot play this specific card game?
To the much wiser, spiritually mature question, does this activity in this environment war against my soul?
Ryle acknowledges that men must judge for themselves and use their liberty, but he warns that we have no right to shut our eyes to the obvious facts.
If an amusement is inextricably bound up with things that God will judge, how can a person who claims to be separate from the world participate in it simply for a few hours of entertainment?
But listening to this level of strictness, the careful monitoring of our evening hours, the strict limitation of lawful hobbies, the severing of intimate worldly friendships, the absolute refusal to compromise on marriage, and the abstinence from popular amusements.
It sounds incredibly heavy. It sounds exhausting to maintain.
How can anyone sustain this kind of relentless self-denial and social friction without burning out? Or worse, becoming a bitter, sour, judgmental Pharisee?
This brings us to the most crucial part of Ryle's treatise, the mechanics of victory. How is this actually accomplished in the human heart? Because sheer willpower is clearly not enough.
If you try to do all of this in your own strength, you will fail, and you will become a miserable Pharisee in the process.
You will be one of those people Ryle describes who has too much religion to be happy in the world and too much of the world to be happy in their religion.
You will just be stuck in a state of constant, resentful deprivation.
So Ryle reveals the arsenal of grace, the 3 secrets to actually overcoming the world.
The first secret is a right heart. And he specifies that this means a heart renewed, changed, and sanctified by the Holy Ghost.
It has to be a heart where Christ himself dwells.
This isn't about forced behavior modification. It is about a fundamental change in your internal appetites.
Ryle uses this brilliant analogy of the beech hedge.
In the winter, the dead brown leaves cling stubbornly to the branches of the beech hedge, rattling in the wind.
You could go out in the freezing cold and try to pull every single dead leaf off by hand, one by one.
It would be tedious, painful, and honestly useless.
But you don't have to do that. When the spring comes, the new buds begin to grow from the inside out.
The new, rising life naturally pushes the old, dead leaves off the branch, and they quietly fall to the ground.
That is exactly how a new heart works. It invariably alters a person's tastes and likings.
You drop the old habits, the worldly amusements, and the toxic friendships, not because you're forcing yourself to be miserable,
But because you simply do not love them anymore.
the expulsive force of a new affection naturally pushes out the old desires.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this biological imagery to the theology of regeneration shows us that outward behavioral changes are completely impossible and hypocritical without internal spiritual life.
The Holy Spirit must alter the bias of the affections. If the affections are not right, the actions never will be.
You can force compliance for a while, but your heart will eventually drag you back to what it truly loves.
Once that new heart is present, the second secret to victory becomes possible, a lively, practical faith in unseen realities.
Ryle points to the first epistle of John, which says that faith is the victory that overcomes the world.
This means attaining a habit of looking steadily at invisible things, God, heaven, hell, final judgment, eternity, as if they were right in front of your physical eyes.
You have to cherish the abiding conviction that what you do not see is 10,000 times more real and weighty than the physical world you do see.
This is how the saints described in Hebrews chapter 11 lived their lives.
Moses was able to forsake the incredible wealth, pleasure, and power of Egypt because he was looking through the telescope of faith.
He could see a future reward that made the glittering treasures of Egypt look like absolute dust.
If you regard this world as a mere passing shadow compared to the solid substance of the world to come, the praise or the blame of secular society completely loses its grip on you.
You no longer care if people mock your strictness, your limits on your schedule, or your dating choices.
Because you are playing for an entirely different audience. You are seeking the approval of God alone.
That telescope of faith changes everything. When you are looking at eternity, the temporary awkwardness of standing up for your faith at a dinner party or turning down a lucrative but shady business deal feels very small.
Which leads perfectly into the third secret of victory. Cultivating the habit of boldly confessing Christ on all proper occasions.
Ryle is careful to say he doesn't want people blowing a trumpet and being obnoxious.
Right, thrusting their religion on others inappropriately just to cause a scene.
But he does want Christians to show their colors plainly. He talks about the concept of grasping the nettle firmly.
If you know anything about a stinging nettle plant, if you brush against it lightly with a trembling, hesitant hand, it stings you terribly and leaves a rash.
But if you reach out and crush it firmly in your grip, it actually doesn't hurt you.
Ryle is saying that taking a bold, polite, but firm stand early on actually prevents the pain of prolonged compromise.
If you calmly and courteously assert your standards in a company of people, it might be hard the first time. Your heart might beat fast.
But a steady assertion forms a habit. A habit forms a character.
And once your character is fully known by the world, they will actually leave you alone.
If you show your colors boldly from the first moment at a new job or with a new friend group, people will know what to expect from you.
They won't keep dragging you into compromising situations or mocking your choices because they already know your answer is going to be no.
The boundary is set and the pressure stops.
The psychology of grasping the nettle is profoundly accurate. Wavering and hesitation invite social pressure. Calm, steady resolve shuts it down.
With the mechanics of victory clearly laid out, internal regeneration by the Spirit, active faith in the unseen, and bold confession, Ryle shifts away from teaching and directly addresses the reader's current spiritual state.
He forces a final application of all these theoretical points. He asks a piercing question that every single person must answer.
Are you overcoming the world, or are you overcome by it?
If you are still entangled, still constantly conforming to the opinions, the fashions, and the habits of those around you, he issues an affectionate but severe warning that your soul is in grave danger.
He reminds the reader that the time is short, the shadows of life are lengthening, and the great white throne of judgment will soon be set.
However, for those who are actively trying to live this out, who have learned by bitter experience what it means to separate but feel exhausted by the constant friction,
He offers tremendous comfort. He assures them that they should take heart and persevere.
you may have had many fierce battles, you may have made false steps and poor decisions, and in moments of weakness, you may have even felt half disposed to go back to the world.
But Christ has never left you, and He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear by His grace.
Ryle makes a magnificent final observation to encourage the weary fighter. No one, at the very end of their life lying on their deathbed, ever looked back and regretted that they had lived too close to God.
That puts everything into perspective. Nobody ever gets to their deathbed and says, I wish I'd compromised more.
I wish I had spent more hours doom scrolling on my phone or watched more garbage television or cared more about what my secular friends thought of my outfit.
It just doesn't happen. The temporary sacrifices, the lost promotions, the awkward conversations, they look entirely different from the perspective of the finish line.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, looking at the invisible carbon monoxide threat of worldly thinking.
We tore down the false ideas of physical isolation and hiding in monasteries.
We examined the real battlegrounds of our daily schedules, our evening exhaustion, and our relationships.
And we identify the internal grace needed to actually overcome this system.
It all points to the reality that following Christ requires a distinct, observable break from the normal patterns of human society.
So as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to mull over on your own.
It builds on everything we've discussed about the danger of a divided heart. Consider the tragic condition of a person who tries to have it both ways.
The person who has too much religion to be happy in the world and too much of the world to be happy in their religion.
They are miserable in both spaces. When the final judgment arrives and all the getting and spending of money, the business deals, the dressing up, the social events, and the late-night amusements pass away forever.
What will you do in a heaven where worldliness has absolutely no place?